recording. And in this episode, I'm going to let the good Aneesh do our lead off while I silence my phone very quickly.
Ooh,
since I'm on call and I've got some post-op patients in house. So at any rate,
all right,
I'll let you take over.
Okay,
yeah.
Wow. I don't know what to do. I've never started in such a long time. So the last time we ended on democracy, we discussed how an oligarchic father can raise a democratic son. And all of these are just ways to look at how thought processes change inside of our minds, and we can change into a democratic mind. And democratic mind, the good in a democracy is freedom, not being attached to any one thing. We can spend time doing whatever we want, participate as much as we want, or not participate at all. Somehow find ourselves eventually in the middle of things. And that could be regarded by some people as moderation or temperance, but it is not the same temperance that you find in a philosophical soul. This is a temperance, the sort of kind of avoiding doing anything, being committed to anything, or being involved in as little or as much as you want, as opposed to temperance where there's a reining in of the appetites. This is actually an appetite that just runs kind of amok. But because there is this oligarchic upbringing where there's some sensibility of what is called necessary appetites and unnecessary appetites, one understands the difference between the two. One can rein the unnecessary appetites and be in this kind of middle zone. So that is the democratic mind. Democratic mind finds itself not being in a position where it wants to lead or be in a position where it wants to follow. It treats its elders as redundant, and it treats
or as equals or children, right?
Sometimes
so they put themselves on, right?
And sometimes they treat their young as revered. And so there are all of these, how should I say, paradoxes that exist inside of a democracy, where wisdom and experience are considered to be meaningless without any merit in a world where anyone can choose to do anything just about any point of time. So that is the democratic person. Now, we would like to believe that democracy, the way we just described it, as being unwilling to participate in anything, not standing up for anything, just spending your time in indulging oneself, to be the worst state that one can be in. But guess what? That is not the worst state that one can be in. There is a state beyond this, which is even worse, and that is the state of tyranny. And so the next part of this conversation, this is the ending of book 8 and going into book 9, is talking about the tyrannical constitution, the tyrannical man, and the tyrannical mind. And the reason why we are here is this is all a way for Socrates to convince his interlocutors about why justice, the practice of justice, despite being thought of as by everybody else to be unjust, the just man, despite being thought of by everybody else to be unjust, is happier than a tyrannical man who's thought by everybody to be just. That was the challenge that was made to Socrates, and he's finally coming around to answering the question. I don't think we'll get to that part of the conversation today, but we will start with we are going to talk about tyranny and maybe get to the end of book 8 and maybe the start of book 9. So that was the lead in. Eddie, you ready?
So and I think it's important to point out also that Socrates frames the transition from democracy to tyranny as one based on this idea of slavery. There's the intrinsic irony to the democratic constitution and the democratic ideal, wherein freedom becomes a good for its own sake. And it just points out the fact that freedom for its own sake is dangerous, potentially, when it's not framed in a larger sense of clear purpose. So freedom for what would be the question. But in a democracy, that for what is not necessarily answered, or people aren't anchored, people's roles are not anchored to a necessary for what. Freedom for its own sake is essentially the social currency of a democracy. And then, Doc, just like you said, that leads to sort of paradoxical thinking, non-committal thinking, situations where the paradox is essentially rationalized away, because what people do is then sort of react to their whims. Sometimes the whims can be self-regarded as a noble decision to pursue a certain line of work or art or something like that. And then it can be overtaken pretty rapidly by things that are more selfish and more hedonistic in terms of the pursuit of pleasures versus the pursuit of some illusion of purpose. And that therein lies in the slavery of democracy, which is where you have now become a slave to the lower elements of the soul, the base desires. And so they're no longer channeled, and they're basically coddled. They're basically, followed without any clear goal. And so this level of slavery, Socrates contends, essentially and quite quietly trains the constitution, the minds of the citizens of this republic to seek or to be vulnerable to somebody who announces that they're going to protect this freedom. What happens is the people, he says, will always set up one man as their special leader, nurturing him and making him great. And this is in response to residual resentment toward the oligarchs in the society. So again, keeping this framework that Socrates is laying out, although he's not trying to be rigid with it, it is helpful, it is useful to remember that the dynamics that cause degradation from one defective constitution to the next, so from democracy to oligarchy to democracy, that current never quite changes. And so what ends up happening is that you just get these progressive stages of degradation. And once you reach the point where you've moved from honor to wealth to just pure freedom as a social currency, you've now primed the population to select somebody who's going to defend this freedom, and quite easily do so. Because all they have to do at this point is point out that there are either oligarchs or there are leaders, or supposed leaders in this group, or people of power that are threatening their freedom.
Yeah. So the thing that I would add, though, to that is freedom is the good, but along with freedom, money is the good. Because this is not about being free and impoverished. Because see, if that was the case, if all you wanted to do was be free and not be tied down with the trappings of a complex life, you wouldn't need to talk about justice. This is going back to the start of the Republic, where he talks about the simple society,
sure,
right? So the reason why the masses choose the leader is because of the fact that inside of a democracy, even though a democracy comes from an oligarchy, it starts with people wanting to focus on wealth.
Right. And that's why I was saying it's still the oligarchic tension that bleeds through this whole degradation process.
Correct. Right? And even in a tyranny, money is still the object. The person who has money has power. And so inside of an oligarchy, though, the people who have money are very temperate with how they spend. As a matter of fact, they're miserly. Mm-hmm. They don't spend it on anything. They don't even want to really show it off as much, right? The democracy comes out of that oligarchic state where that temperance goes away a little bit. You want to show your money off. You want to be free. You want to be. You don't want to be held back by the oligarchic tendencies. And in that society where people are showing off their money, there are three types of people who live inside of a democracy. If you look at our democracy, you see these three people. The largest group is of the regular folks, the folks who don't have much. They are the largest in an assembly because they're the most powerful in an assembly, but they don't have any wealth, right? The next group are the wealthy few. Now, these are the true oligarchs. These are people who, they're not extremely lavish necessarily with their wealth. You don't even see them. You don't even know who they are. Like you won't be able to identify the Koch brothers if you saw them, right? But they are the ones who have the money. They are the ones who are the wealthy, and they don't want anything to do with politics. They don't want to be involved in politics unless someone is challenging the money that they are making. That means they're challenging their ability to make money, right? And who challenges their ability to make money? It is the third class, which is the drones. Remember this drone concept keeps coming up, right? These are people who don't have the money, or they have lost their money, and now they come in two flavors: the stingless ones and the ones with the sting. The stingless ones are the ones who don't have the money and they have nothing that they can do about it. And then the ones that had some money and they lost it, so they have fighting spirit and they're bold. They want to get that power back. They form the ruling class inside of a democracy. So these would be your politicians, right? So in the current democracy, even right now in the US, you have the politicians, you have the wealthy few, and then you have the poor multitudes of money.
Right. The third class would be the largest and most powerful politically, but they're the least active.
That's most people, right?
Right.
And so now, if you think about it, the political elite want money. They're not going to get it from the bottom 99%. They're going to get it from the top 1%. And that top 1% of the wealthy people, they don't want to give up any of their money. As a matter of fact, they want to make as much as they can. So what happens is it's all about influencing politics. That's how super PACs come about. Right?
Yeah. I mean, yeah, when you read this description of democracy, it gives you a sobering opportunity to really re-examine the underlying principles behind any democracy. And I don't think it's, Bertrand Russell has this famous quote where he's like, no idea deserves to be accepted. It doesn't deserve every idea, even the ones that you take for granted, like the one most of us grow up with, which is like democracy is good. Well, good for what?
Yeah.
Right. That's the question. This discussion of democracy, led me to some, very serious, points of contemplation as it pertains to democracy. And they do have, I think, translations to, when it comes to when you have an operating system of the mind that's like a democracy. It's pretty obvious, which is that, if you have an unfocused life and you follow your whims without regard to a larger purpose, it's not going to lead to what you would call in the deepest sense, a good life, a fulfilling life.
No doubt.
Right. So, but going back to how the whole process starts, Socrates says that this leader that essentially gets builds this sort of populist momentum in this democratic society is essentially one who stirs up faction against the rich. That's sort of right.
That's right.
So there's I guess the issue here is that it gets a little mixed, but there's sort of an implicit or unspoken goal behind the leaders, the politicians and the person who will eventually become the tyrannical leader. It is about money, but money and power and influence. Because what the politicians are doing is, they're wanting to get money, but what are they selling? Well, what they're selling and trying to accumulate as if it were a commodity is political influence.
Correct.
Right? And so what's unspoken is that, at the root of it, it's still money, but the way they acquire political influence is to essentially tell the people that they are there to protect their freedom, and their freedom is under threat. and that so-and-so is an oligarch. So the accusation of being an oligarch never disappears in the democratic system.
No, it does not.
And in fact, pointing to somebody and accusing them of being an oligarch does two things. First, it identifies for the public a scapegoat for their troubles. But secondarily, it actually makes the person being accused an oligarch.
Right.
They start to behave like an oligarch because they become miserly. They become, like, as you said, they become political donors. And, if they don't get their way in certain situations, they may actually leave the country. So history is full of examples of where there's a sort of a political elite class. And when the winds of change, political change, start to blow inexorably toward authoritarianism or tyranny, they bounce. They've got the resources to leave.
Right.
And in fact, they're usually some of the ones that make it out, quote unquote, before the feces hits the fan, hits the political fan. And so history is so full of examples that line up with what we're reading here.
But this finger pointing is what happens, right?
Right.
Like, so the masses don't have the time because they are just busy going through the mire of just the regular day-to-day life.
And you know what? Finger pointing is a much more lucrative commodity than even oil.
100%.
Than even oil.
That's right. I mean, the oligarchs say that the politicians are corrupt. The politicians look at the oligarchs and say that they are fleecing the country. And so this finger pointing, this keeps going on. The masses get tired of it, right? And it is not that the masses are actually trying to do something to fix this. They are working two jobs. They're trying to get their kids to school and pay their bills, right? Everybody's just tired of the rich people and the politicians. Till one of these rich people, or maybe a politician of some means, says, you know what? I'm going to blame both of them. I'm going to blame I'm going to fight against the rich people, and I'm going to fight against these politicians. I'm going to come up with this whole people's populist agenda. People are, the only way to get power is to tell because the power actually rests in the hands of the people, right? The populist people, who don't have the energy to fight, to do anything. I'm going to tell them that I'm going to fight for them. And that is the populist agenda, right? You start up saying, oh, no more taxes, and, we're going to get your jobs back, and you're down with, all these big companies, and, down with the political elite. We are going to come up with this whole brand new system now, right? And I've heard that, this is happening right now. Mm-hmm. This is the state of our country right now, if you think about it.
Yeah, I mean, the dynamics are obvious.
There are the rich companies, right? They are not good. And the politicians are not good. I am. This one person is. I know everything, and I'm going to change everything, right?
Only I can fix this.
Yes. And so that is the people tend to set up one man as a special leader,
right?
Nurturing him and making him great.
Right. And the way the special leader essentially consolidates power is by stirring up faction against the rich. And what happens is that there's a critical mass of support that gets reached where now, for the tyrant to become the tyrant, they become somebody who cannot be extinguished. If they're expelled, they're unable to do so, and they will bring him back. And if he ever returns from exile, then he's hailed as a hero. It ends up being this process of a self-fulfilling prophecy toward power, where the more this future tyrant is perceived to be being driven away or driven down from the path of power, the sense of injustice, the Thrasymacheian sense of injustice, is actually what fuels their rise to power. And then when things work out their way, well, then there's always this idea that this is because it was predestined for them to be the one that's going to help us rise up against the rich and the powerful.
I mean, there's so many parallels that can be drawn, right?
Right.
So, this charismatic leader stands up. That I represent the people, right? This person is independently wealthy, right? Has nothing like the people who vote for him, right? But somehow represents the masses against the political elite and against the oligarchy from which he descends. He comes from that. But now suddenly he's the savior of the masses. And he gets vilified in the press. He gets vilified by the political elite. He gets vilified by other oligarchs. But the more he gets vilified by these people, the more he's praised by the masses, right? And the more they try to bring him down by trying to attack him and literally, going after him, the more this person has vitriol towards them. Right. And he tastes blood in the process. Right. And he tastes blood and comes upon victorious. That's it. The bloodlust is there now.
Right.
Now nothing can stop him. Now he can say all the barbs that have been tossed at him, he can absorb and say, yes, I said that. Yes, I touched this woman inappropriately. I did, I said those words. I took money. I stole. I did all those things. But I am reformed now. And you guys are worse.
Right.
And the crowd cheers him on. Yeah.
Right. So this is so now the arrival of the Lycian wolf. Right. That's why Socrates uses the analogy of the wolf who, legendarily, once they've tasted blood, it's, then they acquire a taste for it. They get used to it.
That's right. They want it. They crave the human blood, the human sacrifice here.
Right. They're drunk off of their unexpected triumph. Right. And then you can't turn that off.
And they want that triumph. Right. See, if you take an oligarch, right, just like you said, right, the oligarch, if they they find themselves where they are being tested, that, people are rising up against them, they will flee. They have no taste for this power that comes from the popular vote. They are interested in their money. And so once, as you said, the political wind is not in their favor, they will leave. Mm-hmm. They will go to a foreign land. Because if they stay, they are worried that they are going to get destroyed. Yeah. But the tyrant is different. The tyrant loves the fight. And he's proven victorious before, he's going to be proven victorious again. And if he's proven victorious, oh boy, watch out. Because he's going to stand there, like he says, right? Having brought down all those others, he stands in the chariot of the city as a complete tyrant, instead of a popular leader.
Right. I mean,
you can literally see him like,
welcome to 2024.
Man, this is the thing here is people. There are always going to be people who are going to be brave and bold enough to stand up against the tyrant, right? Now, think about who this tyrant is. This tyrant is not somebody who is, on the path to purpose like you described. This is somebody who comes from this feverish desire for freedom to spend their wealth however they want, in any area that they want, in any pursuit that they want. Now they chose power now. And so they're going to spend lavishly towards the accumulation of power. And once they get it, this person is going to be unstoppable because they have this populace support. They have vanquished all their enemies. Now, what is to stop them from continuing down this path of destruction? There are going to be some trusted advisors, maybe some friends, someone in that group that's going to say, hey, listen, maybe you've gone too far, right?
And they will have signed their death warrant when they do that.
This tyrant is not, tyrants have no friends. There is nobody in their circle that can tell them counter to what they believe. Because they really believe, the tyrant believes that they are supreme.
Right.
They are God.
And what gets ejected systematically within the sphere of the tyrant is trust. Trust becomes progressively barren and gone, which is why the tyrant must ultimately not have friends.
That's right. That's a very important point.
Right.
Because anybody you look around you and you find everybody is, you have either offended them or they are scared of you. You've done something, or you were just worried that they are going to usurp your spot. You cannot trust anybody.
Right.
And all the well-meaning people you had, you put them to death.
Right.
Or got rid of them.
Right. And so now you're this insomniac wolf. You're never going to sleep again.
That's right. And so now you can go to the masses and say, you know what, I fear for my life. Like, I've done all of this for you, and now I have enemies everywhere. Mm-hmm. So the populace people are like, no, we're going to give you we're going to create for you an imperial guard. Like every dictator had this, the imperial guard,
a Praetorian, right?
Right? That were created of men who were just, brainwashed into protecting their leader, the elite troops. Why would a dictator, if you are a tyrant loved by the people, right? Why would you need to have an elite group of people around you all the time?
Well, they end up taking assuming roles, and now here we're going to, a lot of this synergizes with Orwell a lot too. Sort of like in Animal Farm, the leader pigs. What did they have? They had the Dobermans, right? They had the dogs that not only protected them, but when they would make proclamations, and if any of the animals in the farm expressed doubt, the dogs would sneer at them, and then all of a sudden everything was okay. And so, I mean, this is such rich political discussion here. But yeah.
There is also something to be said about how this power is maintained, how people continue to believe that this tyrant that they have sitting on the throne is actually a benevolent leader, right? There has to be
They have to be primed.
They have because they made the choice. You see, people have to believe it's their choice. So once you make a choice, once it's your candidate, your car, your house, you are now some of you responsible for whatever that thing is doing.
Right.
Even if it's a bad choice, this is actually a very well-known concept among humans. Once you take something as yours, you suddenly feel responsible for it now.
Right. And it's very difficult to let it go.
And yeah, because
that
sunk cost fallacy or something, I think is
right.
Because you've already paid the price, you've already made the choice, you don't want to get rid of it. And so this person, you will not think of them as a tyrant. You will think of them as the benevolent leader. And you will believe that the people that this benevolent leader associates with are wise people. And so there is this line here that talks about this, I called it a Thrasymacheian line, where Socrates didn't like tragic poets. He didn't like comic poets either, but tragic apparently were equally bad. He says, tyrants are wise by associating with the wise. And the wise here is not wisdom that we have defined as one of the virtues. This is a Licinian or a wolf-like wisdom.
This is like streetwise. This is just like wise in the ways of manipulation, almost like a Machiavellian wisdom, right?
Yeah, and so you would think about, you have practical wisdom, but of all things evil.
Right.
And I would hate to use the term wisdom because I've come to understand wisdom to be something else altogether. But he says that tragic poets would say that tyrants are wise by associating with the wise. This is Thrasymacheian. Thrasymachus said at some point that this way of being is good. This is the good.
Right. To be unjust
is good.
Secretly, to be openly appearing as just, but to secretly have all of the quote unquote benefits of being unjust.
Correct. And he said that being temperate, being just, being courageous are not good. And Socrates was just aghast when he heard that.
Right.
So this is one of the most Thrasymacheian lines, that tyrants are wise and by associating with the wise. This is conventional wisdom.
Right.
Right? Of today. Right? And these people, these tragic poets, are like influencers. You see what I mean?
Right.
They go from place to place, influencing people, talking about how great the leader is, how great this democracy is, and why one should not live in aristocracies, democracies. And so, as a matter of fact, the inside of an aristocracy, that's the philosopher king, the ideal republic, there is no role for tragic poets or influencers. In the earlier versions, in the earlier chapters of the Republic, there's actually a passage about training of the guardians and talking about what kind of poems should they listen to?
Right. How important the education is.
Correct.
For that precise reason.
And how sophism and this kind of, comics and tragedy, should not be part of their upbringing, because they sometimes talk about things that are
inflammatory and introduce the possibility of victim mindsets and things like that.
Well, yeah.
What you're talking about are political pundits and panderers.
Yeah.
But the main challenge, though, as you look at our current democracy, though, in our particular democracy, I think that's a huge problem. But the problem is that the pundits and the people who you could say are maybe trying to affect positive change for the benefit of what we could call the common good, the problem in our current democracy is that they end up using the same denominator, which is this is what the people want. There's a presumed infallibility of the voters' will.
Yeah.
And here's the biggest problem currently right now.
That's so true.
So politicians often assert the infallibility of the voters' will. And they suggest that any failure lies with other politicians who fail to execute it, rather than the will of the voters themselves, or the will of the voter itself. And think about that. How many times do you hear politicians, whether you agree with them or not, will still invoke the American people want this?
Yeah.
And I would listen and be like, I don't want that. Or nobody's talking about what I want, right? But it's what they use. It's the commodity that they use. But it's the currency of pandering that's required. And whether you're a pundit or if you're a principled politician, you end up having to use the same commodity. That's the only commodity you've got. And what ends up happening is that the message, the reliability, the trust of the politicians will completely erode. Because at that point, if both people are using the same currency to try and buy your vote, right, by pandering that way, nothing's really going to happen.
Yeah, and then the other way to look at this also is when you say the American people, as if it's like one mind,
right?
Right. The only one mind
right,
that exists,
right? 350 million.
The only one mind that exists is that of a philosopher king, that of an ideal republic. Mm-hmm. As a matter of fact, in a democracy, it is a multitudinous mind.
Right.
You have all of this freedom, all of this ways of thinking and expressing and being. There is no one thing that you want.
Right.
You see, except for money and freedom. Maybe money is the one thing everybody wants.
Right.
As a matter of fact, the reason why you devolve into a tyranny from a democracy is because the largest, most populous group has the least amount of money, but they want more money.
Right.
And now they're looking at the oligarchs and the politicians to make that happen. But when they find the tyrannical leader, they believe that person is going to make them rich. Mm-hmm. At least, if not them rich, he's going to make sure, he or she is going to make sure that the oligarchs don't get any richer and the politicians have to pay for their sins.
Right.
But it is this multitudinous mind. That's why democracies fail.
Right. Well, yeah, they fail because and again, it goes back to this idea of how the guardians, to the extent that they even exist in the society, were trained. And so, this is why democracy lives and dies on the education of the voters, how they're educated, what they're educated about, and as the quality and content of that education deteriorates, they become even more susceptible to the process of demagoguery.
And when you say education, I know it's not, you don't talk about the education that we receive in schools.
No, we're not talking about math. Okay, we're talking about and understanding the rules of your own republic. I mean, how many people are completely unaware of the pillars, the principles that forest the Constitution, like pillars. And people, they're lost in them. They're misinterpreting them. They really don't understand the civic workings of a constitution, and understanding the idea, the strength of the checks and balances, and how they were really intended to limit authority.
Yeah,
right. That's the whole point.
Right. Understanding the American Constitution requires you to. The U.S. Constitution requires you.
That's an example. That's an example of what type of education you should. So yes,
that's right.
Right.
The founding fathers who wrote the Constitution, the education that they had,
capital J justice,
right,
capital H happiness.
That's right. That is the
They
education
knew.
that
They read this stuff.
that's how they came up with this. They read the Republic, and that's how they could come up with the Constitution for the U.S. Constitution. And who's teaching the Republic? To whom?
Yeah.
It's not happening.
No.
So education, when you say the masses should be educated, people say, yeah, but we have free education after high school. That's not the education we're
right,
talking
I mean
about.
in the Socratic sense.
Right.
Yeah, right.
And then and Socrates lays down the education that's required for a mind to be able to look away from the shadows in the cave.
Yeah.
He talks about the education there, right? It's not only the education that comes from books. There is physical training. There is training in music. There is training in dialectic discussion. There's all of these things that need to happen. Now, if you do that, you're not going to find enough, programmers and, the people to, go to medical school.
But I think that's why they focus so much on the checks and balances, because they knew they weren't going to have a philosopher king, right? Because if you have a philosopher king, then who decides who the philosopher king is from the starting point that they were at? So the best thing that you can do, since you can't have a philosopher king, is better essentially to, in a way, treat nobody as trustworthy, which is the whole idea behind the checks and balances in the system, right? Everybody can check somebody else. Nobody has absolute authority.
Now, you're talking about the U.S. Constitution. But again, I think that there is something to be said about, this is not about, we've always said this, right? The Republic is not about writing a constitution. If you had to go ahead and do it, and Socrates spoke about how it's possible. It is not impossible to create the ideal republic run by a philosopher king. It can be done. But he talks about what is required for that to happen. He talks about the great lie. He talks about those things. But in order for that to happen, every individual inside of that republic has to have an ordered republic inside of them. It is an individual's responsibility to create an ideal republic inside.
Right.
But I can tell you that, someone would say, well, someone could say I have the ideal republic inside of me. How would you counter that? How would you know? I'm telling you, you can tell. There is a way to know.
You'd have to determine that by their actions.
The action is the only way.
And the decisions they make.
Right?
Yeah.
The action is the only way.
Right.
And what is the driver of those actions? Right? Acting good so that you're perceived as good. Mm-hmm. As doing it for acting good for its own sake.
Good for what? Freedom for what?
Right. And I do get it. Like, I'm not saying that this is possible for tomorrow for the United States or for any other country to suddenly have a bunch of philosopher kings walking around. This is not the reason to read this book. Is not to figure out what's wrong, what ails your democracy or your country. It is to figure out what ails you.
But I think there are some very lucid insights in this description of democracy that obviously, you see it around you.
That's why this book was written. Right. It is written in such a way that you can take what is happening to 350 million people, so that you can look at what is happening inside of you. Mm-hmm. Right? That is the exercise here. He talks about it. In order to look at justice in an individual, let's look at justice in a republic. Yeah. And that's why we talk about the constitution of tyranny. Right. As opposed to as we're going to go into this next, what's a tyrannical mind or a tyrannical man?
Well, yeah. And in sort of my reflection of democracy, there's one other sort of question or critique that I came upon as I sort of reflected on this description of the democracy. And this is kind of a more practical interpretation of this idea of being unfocused, like it's by rationalizing the paradoxes, putting the needs and the goods on the same level. And the problem in a democracy, one of the baked-in problems, which is why it's so dependent on the education level of the citizens, is that democracy is obligated to preserve a system of participation, even to those who would aim to destroy the system. So think about that. So when you think about like the operating system of the mind, the republic of the mind, this is why it's so important to have an apex principle or a philosopher king, because you don't allow for participation of individuals who are there to destroy the system. Because think about it. So, in a hypothetical situation, and the answer to this question is something to just think about. But are people who committed to democracy obligated to recognize as legitimate a party that has succeeded to gain control by a majority vote? That's a good question. So we have a system of checks and balances. We have this political party within the system who they want to sort of rewrite everything, and they win through, let's say they win through legitimate concerns. This is the problem with majority rule. That's the pointing. What I'm pointing out is that there's a majority rule fallacy. And the majority rule only works if there is an ambient level of education and commitment to checks and balances. And once that's lost, it's like what happens to the person who becomes themselves tyrannical. They become somebody who says, well, I'm going to do, because I've tasted this, I'm going to do it because it feels good, or this is what I want. Okay? And this is why the idea of having an aristocratic mind wouldn't allow for these things. This undergirds the importance that Socrates put on the education and the things you allow to use as informing principles as to how you order your mind to avoid this situation in particular.
Yeah, but also he also talks about innate ability.
Right, there's an innate ability to it too. So
because some people are innately by nature are democratic. That means they're honor seeking. There are those who are wealth seeking, and those who are freedom seeking, and those who are power seeking.
Yeah.
And so you may try your best to temper your innate nature, but it's going to show up in some point or another. And it's important for one to realize that. So again, if we move on from this, the next order of business, when this tyrannical human being is now getting rid of all his friends and wise people and has surrounded himself by this imperial guard, right? Suddenly they find themselves in this. They are tyrannical by nature. They are driven by passions. They are illiberal in their appetites, and they are spending. They're acquiring and spending, and beyond a certain point, they can no longer be supported by the masses that initially put them up on that pedestal. And the only way now to topple the tyrannical leader is by rebellion. Mm-hmm. But before you get to that rebellion stage, there's a stage when the masses come to understand that in order to protect their freedoms, this goes back to the line that you said, they chose the worst form of slavery by choosing to be a slave to this person who is himself a slave to his passions.
Right.
There is no master in this,
right?
Except for passion. Passion is the master. What I mean by passion is like this is. They talk about passion. There's a beautiful line here about what that passion is, and we'll come to that. But that is what the whole state devolves into. Right.
It devolves into a state of abjection. Right. Everything is just abject, meta slavery. Essentially, is what you can think of it. But I don't want to give the listeners an impression that we're going to I don't know. I don't want to say that we're bashing democracy, because I don't think that we can democracy. And I just want to end on a positive note on democracy. And here's what I would say. So yes, it's true that people don't always know what's best for them, but democracy allows us an opportunity to change things so that we don't have to suffer our stupid decisions once we recognize them.
Again, man, this is not about constitutions. This is, again, the democracy that they're talking about here is not a democratic republic like how we have in the US. This is not one man, one vote in the US. There's no I don't think there are very few places where that's the case. Where there's a democratic caucus where there's one person, one vote.
I'm not saying that the same thing, but what I'm saying is that I draw reflections from this reading, and obviously there's going to be practical applications to the political landscape around me. And so, and that's what we're talking about.
I see. Yeah, I see what you mean, and I agree. I mean, I'm not saying that we should go back to like the Gilded Age. Well, not Gilded Age. What was the age when it was all monarchies and stuff? I'm not saying we should go back to that.
Medieval
that's not,
times.
Yeah, I mean, that's terrible. Like that's not what we're talking about here. This is about how you order your own mind inside of you.
Sure, yeah.
And I think when we talk about the tyrannical mind, it'll make sense as to what is, when we talk about a democracy, how does that come about inside of, how does that devolve into in a tyranny inside of your own mind, right? So
right, we essentially enter the mind of what Thrasymachus would call, ironically, justice,
right? This is book 9. So we start with book 9. Finally, we've reached book 9. One more chapter to go. Man, it's crazy. Okay, all right. So the tyrannical mind. So he says that this is a conversation about how what's going on inside of a tyrannical mind, right? Tyrannical mind is lawlessness. It is just full of thoughts of pleasure and fulfilling of pleasures and these appetites. And these appetites and pleasures are not the necessary ones. I mean, in oligarchy, we discussed this, where an oligarch wants to seek money, and would only spend that money on necessary things and not on the unnecessary things. And that's what separates the oligarch from the democrat. The democrat also seeks money, but then ends up spending it also on things that are unnecessary. And when it comes to a tyrannical mind also wants money, but only wants to spend it on the unnecessary ones as much as they can, right? It would be, you could think of this tyrannical mind to be driven by the appetites, and not just any appetite that is like the bestial appetite. And Socrates talks about it. Every human being inside of our minds, we have that beast existence in all of us. It's kept in check, but it's there. Inside every man and woman, there's this beast that can be unleashed at any moment, and it's kept in check by our better parts of our mind. Right now, inside of a philosophical mind, which is ruled by the apex principle, the philosopher king, and it's governed by the guardians who are trained, and the wisdom is what rules, and the appetites are kept in check. And even the appetitive side, the appetitive elements exist only in a way to support this triad.
Right. I would say channeled over checked.
Correct.
Yeah.
And
because you need that appetite.
You need to eat. You need to procure, but you do it only in a way to kind of keep everything in order. There's this temperance. There's this order. It's all guided by wisdom, right? And now a tyrannical mind is flipped the other way around. Like the base is on top and the apex is towards the bottom. As a matter of fact, there's not that much wisdom really. So it's all just driven by the appetites. The appetites rule roost. And so that's the distinction between a tyrannical mind and a philosophical mind. And so how does a tyrannical person come to be? This is the father-son analogy, where there's an oligarchic father leads to a democratic son. Now, the democratic son,
yeah, I mean, Socrates says, going back right before book 9, he says a tyrant is parricide. So this analogy of the father-son degradation of the states, tyranny is when the son kills the father. Right,
it's coming up. And so the democratic son, remember, he was the one whose father was oligarchic. He had money, but he only spent money on what was necessary, right? Good quality clothing, but not lavish. Good food, healthy food, but not, luxuries, things like that. And the democratic son, though, because of his friends and the drones that are surrounding him, who tell him, "Man, why the heck do you live like your father does? He's illiberal. He doesn't have any class. Like, come on, you could drive this fancy car, you can eat all this food, you can do all of this, participate in luxuries." And so he chooses that life. And then, but since he has a little bit of his father's upbringing, he comes a little bit in the middle, where he shows off his wealth, but not too much, right? He chooses to participate, but not so much. And so that moderation, that middle ground, which is a quote unquote moderation, is where he lives. That's the democratic father. Now he's grown up to be a man. Now he has a son, right? Who's brought up in this lap of appetitive luxuries, where driving fancy cars, eating fancy food, showing off your wealth, being involved in this, not being involved in something else or whatever. Now you can imagine the drones that this person is going to encounter in his life, right? They are going to try to persuade this person to be even more liberal with the way that he spends his time, money, and the way they do that is by injecting him with passion for something, whatever that thing would be. Most likely, it's going to be power. They inject that passion into him. So now gone is the moderation of his democratic father. And now suddenly you have this person who has this passion, and he calls passion the great winged drone. The largest, you can imagine, like there's this caricature in your mind, like this, big, huge winged, slothy drone,
The arch drone.
Yeah, of all these little tiny drones, and around this drone are buzzing all of these appetites of incense and perfume and wreaths and wine and all the other pleasures that are found in such company. They feed the drone, make it grow as large as possible, and plant the sting of longing inside of it. Now you have this passion and longing, and then this popular leader of the soul adopts madness as their bodyguard. So this tyrannical leader now, who is this full of passion and longing for all this of the appetites, now has madness as his bodyguard and is stung to frenzy. Right? If there are any such beliefs inside of this being that are channeled towards the good, the rational, right? What is going to happen to those thoughts? They're just going to be squashed. So when we talk about the pyramid,
I would say they'd be vaporized.
Completely.
I mean, they're right. There'd be blips. I mean,
this ordered relationship.
They would only serve to fuel just reactionary behavior. I mean,
the reason is gone. Right. There's this ordered relationship between the philosophical mind, the apex principle, being the apex of the pyramid, and the base being the appetites. We said it's going to be flipped over, but guess what? It's not just going to be flipped over. There's not going to be an apex pointing downwards. There is no reason. There is no wisdom here, right? He says this. It's just a word. That is why passion has been called a tyrant. Passion is tyranny. Now, inside of our minds, we say this all the time, man, follow your passion.
I don't think that's the passion he means.
Man, I'm telling you, like if you think about it, right? When you talk about passion, what can we be passionate about? Passion means that it's not reason.
Right.
You are driven by something.
Right. Reason is dispassionate. Yes.
You see?
Right.
So you have to be, these words have meaning, they carry a lot of meaning. And if you go back to, I was thinking about this, when you go back to chapter 1 of the Republic, right? Cephalus, the wise old man, right? The guy that Socrates, this is all happening in Cephalus's house, by the way. We're still in Cephalus's house. Paul Marcus, who's Cephalus's son. And Cephalus comes and wants to talk to Socrates. Socrates says, hey, tell me about old age. You're an old man. I'm an old man too, but I can learn from you. And he says, tell me what happens. And what about, the sex and good food?
He's free from his passions.
And that's right.
He's happy because he's free from his passions.
He says, the word is, I feel like I'm no longer slave to a deranged and savage master.
Right.
Old age has rid me of these passions. The passions are a deranged and a savage master. And that's exactly what the tyrannical...
Right, the hedonistic passions, yeah. Right.
And that's what it is. This is what, inside of our minds, we have to realize what role these passions play.
Right. Passion for what?
Correct.
I think it's very important to add that for at the end.
But you see, even if you say passion, you can passionate for wisdom. This doesn't work.
Yeah, it does.
Because
why not?
Because in order to choose wisdom, it is not something that you would do because you're passionate for it.
But the context matters when you use. That's what I'm saying when you use the word passion. I interpret this as hedonistic passion. What he's talking about.
But again, I don't think there's any other way to look at passion, because the way he describes it here, passion has long been called a tyrant. Because if you are passionate for wisdom, it's not a choice that you're making. But passion is not a choice. It's, at least this is the understanding that I get from here. Yeah. You don't choose your passion. And if you don't choose your passion, it's like saying, this guy, there's this joke, there's this thing about there's this guy who's walking along a shoreline, and suddenly he sees this person is drowning, and they're crying out for help, and he's about to just dive in. He sees this brave person just jump off the bridge into the water and lands right next to this person who's drowning, and then somehow makes his way to the shore with this other guy in tow. He rescues him essentially. So both of these men, the man who got rescued and the man who rescued him, both come onto the shore. This man, before he's about to jump in, he goes up to this guy and says, "Oh my gosh, you saved this man. You risked your life by jumping off this high bridge and all that. You're just awesome. You tell me who you are. You need to be felicitated." He's like, "Forget all this. We need to find out who pushed me off the bridge." Yeah, that is what this is.
Yeah.
If you're you just find yourself in a situation where you did something good.
Yeah.
That's the most involuntary of all things. Passion is the most involuntary of all of this.
Oh, yeah, I get that. And I just, the word passion, the way it's used here, to me, I ascribe to it a very specific hedonistic aspect to it, and not the loose. I would totally agree that it's used very loosely in common parlance, and it's probably something that people should think deeply about.
But then you have this person now, right, who has this passion, this run. This person is not the master of his own mind. The master of this person's mind is passion. The person is already a slave to a deranged and savage master.
Right. This the word I was looking for was that this is kind of a narcissistic drive. The passion,
self-love, maybe, but what I'm saying is that this person is it's like, there's this there's a parasite that is sitting on top of this person's head and is controlling his mind. It's like one of those weird alien movies where you're just now a zombie to this thing that's sitting on top of your head. This great wingless drone sitting on top of your head. This passion.
Right. It's the ultimate state of abjection. Right.
Correct.
It's abject slavery. Slavery to the point where even your will has been co-opted.
Now you take this person, right, who's the tyrant, right, who's meting out injustice to everybody, who lives inside this lap of luxury but is just being stung into a frenzy by this passion, and the philosopher king. And you ask yourself, which mind would you rather have? Where is happiness? Where does happiness reside? Where does peace reside? Where is, purpose, common good? Where does it reside? Right? This is where we're coming to eventually.
Right.
When we talk about...
This is the cusp now of the Thrasamachian question.
But he talks about what this person would do as they go through life, as they are being consumed by this parasite of passion, right? They're slave to this, how their life will unfold in front of them, how they will be taking as much as they can for themselves. First of all, the reason why they can do this is because they have the property and the wealth of their father. They weren't the multitudinous poor. They were the son of an oligarch, Democrat, and now they have money, they have all that. And they start from that position of privilege, and they keep using and using and using, and eventually they come to a point where they become like a parasite onto their father or their mother, and they're willing to at some point strike them down for their own personal gain. And that is the point that you are making.
Yeah.
And all of these father and son conversations, none of the sons ever caused harm to their father. As a matter of fact, the oligarch comes from the democratic father after the downfall of the democratic father. He sees the downfall of his father and vows that it's never going to happen to him.
Right. There's an unleashing process
Correct.
that happens because in the early phases of the degradation, there's always at least a residual token commitment to the founding principles of the previous system. Right.
You respect your father.
Right. And in tyranny. And so that's why, from the operating of the mind standpoint to the political interpretation of this, is that you are literally decapitating the system. So just like the middle and higher elements of the soul essentially become amputated and tossed away in the process of becoming a tyranny, it happens in a real and practical sense in authoritarian political systems. It's precisely what happens. There is no middle class. There is no lower class. There is people in abject states of subservience, and a leader, like as you said, who's subservient to their own narcissistic, hedonistic passions. And that's essentially what you have.
And then this concept of not holding anything sacred. The oligarchic son holds the honors of his democratic father sacred.
Mm-hmm.
The democratic son holds the restriction of the appetites of his oligarchic father sacred. That's why he comes to moderate himself. The tyrannical son doesn't hold any of the concepts of his father's upbringing. He doesn't hold any of that sacred. He's driven by this passion, this wing drum. And it says here, it says that Ideomatus says that, he would, Socrates says that, he's going to basically strike his old father, the oldest of his friends, who was no longer in the bloom of youth. And Socrates says...
when he says it's a great blessing to produce a tyrannical son.
It seems to be a great blessing to produce a tyrannical son. Obviously, he's being sarcastic.
Yeah, it's Socratic irony at its ultimate,
really.
in its ultimate form.
The tyrannical mind, man. And I have looked at this process. And the only thing that I find that it is unlikely that one starts at the beginning, that is, has a philosophical mind, run by an apex principle, and devolves into tyranny. I feel if one is, most of us have a tyrannical mind. What means is we are driven by our passions. And if we are lucky, we make it to a state where we are democratic. That means we figure out what is the necessary and the unnecessary ones. We do partake in the unnecessary ones, but at least we find ourselves not being drawn completely towards one or the other. We feel that is the best life. You ask somebody, I want to do what I want to do. I don't want to be told what to do. And we participate in what we want. If we lose interest, we participate in something else. And that is the democratic mind. And then we go from there into an oligarchic mind where we only participate in what we believe is necessary. And then we hold on to our resources and our reserves. And the best we can do is make it to that oligarchic state. And you find very few people who are actually able to do that, where they're able to not now worry so much about their passions. And this would be someone like Cephalus in a way, right? Who's made his money. And, he doesn't spend too much on his passions or whatever. He's just living his life happily. Now, you take that person, and the next step up is doing things that will bring you honor. You have the money, but now you're ready to spend that money for honor and in honorable pursuits, right? Not for passions, for honorable pursuits. But that is probably, you would still see fragments of that. Few people in the world who are able to do that. There are books written about these people, and they've done honorable things, but they've done it for honor's sake. But you will very rarely find somebody who's transcended from that to a true philosophical king, the aristocratic mindset, where
practically because
virtue you wouldn't know about. You wouldn't even know about it. Right. That's right. So, where virtue reigns supreme. Everything is done for the common good. Everything is done only for virtue, for virtue's sake. Justice for justice's sake, not to show, not for money, not for anything else.
Right. Yeah, I think ultimately here, the issue has to do with issues of restraint, reason, and maturity. And in many ways, we all come into this world as tyrants. We're all little tyrannical infants, right? Driven by our drive. And, the quality of the education is what really makes the biggest difference. Now, everybody has innate tendencies toward, the tyrannical, hedonistic side of things. You can argue that people have natures that predispose them one way or the other. But if you have a potent, robust, formidable education, you can at the very least mitigate the likelihood that you'll fall into a tyrannical state of mind, which is largely, I think you can think of quite accurately as a regression. You're regressing to that. You're the most immature you could be in the tyrannical mindset.
That's right. It is the most immature state. But it is a state where I think you find yourself in life. I know I've been in this tyrannical state, driven by passions, and you cannot help it. It's not like a choice. Your passions are not necessarily a choice. It's part of that brain that is not necessarily developed. It takes a while for your prefrontal cortex to get wired in, and how that gets wired and what leads to its wiring. When does it get wired in? Like, it is known that in some people, the prefrontal cortex gets wired at a much younger age.
Yeah.
Almost when they're 18, 19. And some people, it doesn't get wired in their 30s. Average is 25, 26 before your rational part of your mind actually kicks in. So how you train yourself?
The training is of utmost importance.
Correct. Because you realize the nature is you can't choose when your prefrontal cortex are wired in. There's some kids out there whose prefrontal cortex starts getting wired in at 15, 16.
Right.
Those people are the gold.
So
those can be the guardians.
Right. So whether you're talking about actual republics or republics of the mind, education is everything.
But you see, there's also this thing about the innate ability. But there's also something to be said about when you say education, it is not, again, we have to be careful about what we say.
I'm using education in the Socratic sense. Right. Yeah.
This development, what they're talking about, that coupled with this innate ability and understanding that till your prefrontal cortex is wired in, you don't know what that means. And once it gets wired in, you have an idea what it means. That means there is no 18-year-old CEO, man. I mean, come on, even 25, 26, your prefrontal cortex.
There isn't. I mean, it seems like nowadays.
Everywhere. .com. I mean, these guys are making millions.
You got startups and.
Instagram influencers, you have no idea of what it is. You would not know what it is to lead a good life. Because your rational brain is not active. You are still you have a tyrannical mind. And it's not a fault. It's just development. That's what happens.
Yeah, there's a maturity process, and there's exposures. Not just, I should say, education, but exposure as well. You've got to live in conversation with the trials and tribulations of life, with the consequences of your decisions, and that's part of that's the unwritten education.
No doubt, that's what he talks about in this, right? When he talks about the cave allegory,
for sure,
he talks about the timeline,
right? And
the timeline is that at 2025, that is the time when you are ready to start having conversations about what is the nature of the good. In order to be able to talk about the good, you have to have a rational mind, and that rational mind gets wired around 2025. But it's not enough. You then have to start having conversations with people and have the ability to have a dialectic conversation where you are not trying to argue for the sake of arguing to win. That's what a tyrannical person would do.
They're passionate about winning. There's the for, right? Arguing for what?
For what?
For truth seeking? Right. Yeah. Arguing to win a debate. That's something else entirely different. And that's right. And that's not of the realm that they're interested in.
That's what a democratic person
on the divided line. That's not of the intelligible realm. If you try to understand the intelligible realm, that's a different thing, right?
The democratic person would want to argue with someone wiser than them just to put them down because they have the paradox. They feel that wisdom is unnecessary. It's illiberal. You see what I mean? And so you go from a tyrannical mind to a democratic mind, you're still not ready. There is still some sharpening of stuff that has to happen. And the dialectic conversations and all of that, then your appetites start getting, you start controlling your appetites. You come to understand necessary, unnecessary ones. Then you have to go out in the world and actually gain notoriety in the world, because if you want to influence the world, you have to go back down the cave and participate in the world. And that takes time. So this process, this conversation, everything kind of lines up with our life.
I think the challenge with maturity is being able to, because again, that reminded me about going back down to the cave. And when it's happening within yourself, the introspective metacognitive version of this is that once you've reached a level of maturity, you could almost define maturity as the ability to move the epicenter of your thinking from the apex principle into the guardian level and into the ambitious drive level things and back up without ever disrupting the symmetry and geometry of that pyramid.
That's right. That's a very well way.
That's the way I would think of it.
Yep.
We should end it there.
I agree. I was getting too passionate.
Yeah.